Entitled people always suffer from the same psychological blind spot. They assume your boundaries are flexible because you haven't punished them yet. They mistake peace for helplessness. Welcome back to the archive. I'm Jess, and today we open a file on a neighbor who treated a private backyard like a free supply depot. He thought he was being clever. He didn't realize he was dealing with someone who doesn't negotiate, they calculate. Let's look at the data. I do not react to problems. I document them. That distinction has served me well over the years, and it is the only reason I noticed what my neighbor was doing before he had the chance to deny it convincingly. It began with a mower, a modest machine with a tank that holds roughly 1 quart of fuel. Simple arithmetic. A full 5-gallon can last me the better part of a season with usage like mine. Yet every time I walked to the back patio to tackle the lawn, the can was nearly empty. Not low, nearly empty. The kind of empty that does not happen through ordinary use. The kind that requires another explanation entirely. I did not say a word to anyone. I simply began to pay attention. I noted the dates. I tracked the intervals. I observed my neighbor's habits. When he mowed, when he drove, how often he moved between his garage and yard. The picture that assembled itself was not flattering to him. This was before inexpensive home security systems were commonplace, so I improvised. I repurposed a laptop, installed motion detection software, and aimed the webcam at the back patio before leaving the house one morning as usual. I returned to the footage that evening with a cup of coffee and no particular urgency. He had walked into my yard within 5 minutes of my car leaving the driveway. Unhurried, familiar, the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. I watched the clip twice, closed the laptop, and sat quietly for a while. I had a decision to make, and I already knew exactly what I was going to do. He had given me something far more useful than anger. He had given me time, motive, and evidence, and now I intended to use all three. There is a particular kind of satisfaction that belongs to the architect of a plan, not the person who loses their temper in a driveway. I have always preferred to be the architect. I considered my options methodically. I could file a police report, but what would that accomplish? A warning at best, a dismissal at worst, and a neighbor who would simply become more careful. I could confront him directly, but confrontation without leverage is just noise. I wanted something more instructive, something he would carry with him. The solution presented itself with almost elegant simplicity. The gas can was the instrument of his theft. It would become the instrument of his correction. Over the following week, I made use of the can in a manner not found in any manufacturer's manual. Each contribution was deliberate. The smell of gasoline is persistent enough that the substitution would not be immediately apparent to someone who had never looked too closely at what he was taking. He had always relied on the container's appearance and scent. I saw no reason to disturb either. Once the contents were suitably adjusted, I restored the can to its usual position on the patio. Then I attended to the theater of the thing. I checked the fluids in my car with visible thoroughness. I moved a few bags to the trunk. I was unhurried, methodical, and clearly visible from the street. I made certain he had every reason to believe I was preparing for an extended absence. What I was actually preparing for was something far more enjoyable. I drove away at an ordinary pace, watching the rearview mirror, and I gave him exactly 1 hour. I had set the stage, loaded the prop, and cast my unwitting co-star. All that remained was to see whether he would perform on cue. I drove a short loop, parked 2 streets over, and waited. There was no rush. The plan did not require my presence to execute, only my patience to observe the results. When I pulled back onto our street approximately an hour later, the first thing I saw was him in his front yard. He was pulling the starter cord on his mower with the kind of intensity that goes well beyond frustration. His face had taken on a vivid, pressurized quality. The cord was being yanked as though it had personally wronged him. The machine did not respond. Engines are, in this way, admirably honest. I parked quietly, retrieved my mail, and watched from a comfortable distance with the unhurried air of a man returning from an uneventful errand. I offered nothing, no expression, no acknowledgement, no eye contact. I simply went inside. Some time later, I heard a car start up from the adjacent property. He was presumably abandoning the mower project in favor of whatever errands required the fuel he had also redirected into his vehicle's tank. I watched from the window as he pulled out, drove the length of the block, made it perhaps 200 meters further, and coasted to a stop against the curb. The car did not move again. I made myself a modest lunch. I read for a while. Eventually, I walked back to the patio. The gas can was where I had left it, in the precise spot that had made it accessible and visible for months. I picked it up. I tilted it. Nothing shifted inside. Empty. Completely and thoroughly empty. The account was settled, or so I thought. It was only later that I discovered the gas can had been the least interesting entry on his record. A person of limited imagination would have considered the matter closed. I found, upon reflection, that I was not quite finished. In the weeks that followed, I made it a point to learn more about my neighbor. Not from gossip, but from public record. What I discovered was that he had accumulated a set of outstanding arrest warrants that the relevant authorities had not yet found a convenient occasion to execute. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man who had been deferring a number of obligations to the justice system. I considered this information for some time. Most counties and municipalities operate a civilian ride-along program, an initiative designed to build community relations by allowing members of the public to accompany officers during a standard patrol shift. The application process is, in most jurisdictions, entirely unremarkable. It asks for a name, a contact address, and a date of availability. It does not ask whether the applicant has any outstanding legal complications that might complicate the encounter. I submitted an application on his behalf. I used his name. I used his address. I selected a date that I estimated would suit everyone's schedule. I will leave the details of what followed to your imagination, though I will note that law enforcement officers conducting pre-shift checks tend to be thorough, and that the address on a ride-along application is, logically, where one expects to find the applicant. I never raised my voice. I never knocked on his door. I never sent a single hostile message. I simply arranged the available pieces into a logical sequence and allowed the systems already in place to complete the work. The quiet ones always finished the game. He had assumed, as people like him always do, that no one was paying close enough attention. He was mistaken about that from the very beginning. The neighbor expected a free tank of fuel. Instead, his arrogance cost him his lawnmower, his vehicle's engine block, and ultimately his freedom. When you steal from someone who understands strategy, you aren't just taking an asset. You are signing your own warrant. If you want to analyze how another masterclass in malicious compliance completely dismantled a toxic ego, click the video file on your screen right now. I'll see you there.